The crystal shattered in his bare hand. Blood poured over the pristine white linen. It pooled around the delicate spun sugar of my dessert station, staining the gold leaf a violent crimson. He did not blink. He did not flinch. He only stared down at me with eyes like a frozen ocean. To understand the absolute terror of that moment, you have to understand the suffocating world that built it. It was 11 at night in the heart of Boston. I was standing in the grand ballroom of a historic Back Bay hotel, surrounded by the kind of wealth that operates entirely above the law. The ceiling was a sprawling masterpiece of gold leaf and crystal chandeliers. The floor was imported Italian marble. The air was freezing, heavily conditioned to keep the wealthy guests from sweating in their bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns. I was not a guest. I was the invisible labor. My name is Maeve. I was the lead pastry chef for an elite catering firm that serviced the untouchable 1% of New England. For 14 hours, I had been on my feet. My shift had started before dawn in the chaotic, stainless steel trenches of a commercial kitchen in South Boston. I had spent the morning burning my forearms on industrial ovens, breathing in the heavy scent of melting dark chocolate, brown butter, and vanilla bean. Now, I was standing in a corner of this opulent ballroom, serving miniature works of art to people who looked right through me. The catering company forced us into tight, unforgiving black uniforms. The fabric was cheap and rigid. It dug mercilessly into my generous hips and thick thighs. I am a plus-size woman. In the working-class neighborhoods of Boston, my body was just a body. But in this hyper-gentrified, untouchable world of corporate elites, my body was considered an offense. The women in this ballroom were starving. They were sharp angles, hollow cheeks, and plastic perfection. They drank vodka on ice and pushed their food around on porcelain plates. When they walked past my dessert station, they looked at my lush curves with a toxic mixture of pity and disgust. They saw my size as a moral failure. They saw my presence as a stain on their perfect, curated evening. But I had learned to wear my reality like a quiet armor. I refused to shrink myself for their comfort. I stood tall behind my station, arranging delicate dark chocolate truffles and spun sugar cages with absolute precision. My feet throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. The muscles in my lower back screamed in protest. But I kept my face perfectly blank. In the service industry, your exhaustion is not allowed to exist. You are a ghost who hands out champagne and clears away the debris of the rich. The event was a corporate retreat for a massive hedge fund. The room was filled with tech billionaires, corrupt politicians, and men who traded human livelihoods like poker chips. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cigars, spilled champagne, and arrogant laughter. I hated every second of it. The only thing keeping me anchored was the memory of a conversation I had earlier that evening. Jasper was the floor manager for the catering company. He was 30 years old, charming and effortlessly handsome. He had the kind of progressive, soft-spoken demeanor that made you feel instantly safe. While the other managers barked orders and treated the kitchen staff like cattle, Jasper always smiled. He always asked how my day was going. Just 2 hours ago, in the chaotic hallway behind the kitchen doors, Jasper had brushed his hand against my shoulder. He had looked at me, really looked at me, and told me that my pastries were the only genuine thing in this entire building. He had lingered. He had smiled a slow, warm smile that made my chest flutter. For a woman who was constantly told by society that she took up too much space, Jasper's attention felt like a lifeline. I held on to that small, warm memory as the freezing air of the ballroom bit through my thin uniform. I told myself that the grueling labor was worth it. I told myself that maybe, just maybe, someone in this cold world actually saw me. I was a fool. At exactly 15 minutes past 11, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. The change in the atmosphere was instantaneous. It was not a subtle shift. It was a violent drop in temperature. The low hum of arrogant conversation died in the throats of the wealthy elite. The string quartet playing in the corner faltered, the cellist missing a note as a wave of primal dread washed over the room. I looked up from my tray of truffles. A man was walking into the ballroom. He was a towering force of nature. 6'4", built of solid marble and suppressed violence. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than I made in 3 years, but he did not look like a corporate executive. He looked like a predator who had just kicked open the doors of a cage. This was Victor. I did not know his name yet. I did not know that he was the apex predator of the New England syndicate. I did not know that he controlled the ports, the politicians, and the very ground we were standing on. All I knew was that the air around him felt heavy, dark, and terrifyingly absolute. He was flanked by 3 men. They moved with the synchronized, hyper-vigilant grace of wolves. The man directly behind Victor was tall, lean, and had eyes like dead ash. I would later learn his name was Kieran, Victor's chief enforcer. Kieran's gaze swept the room, calculating every exit, every shadow, every potential threat. But Victor did not look at the room. He looked straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his broad shoulders radiating a terrifying tension. As he walked deeper into the ballroom, the untouchable 1% of Boston parted for him. These arrogant billionaires and corrupt politicians scrambled out of his way like frightened sheep. They pressed themselves against the walls, spilling their champagne, desperate to avoid his path. I watched, paralyzed behind my dessert station. Victor was fresh from a negotiation. I could tell by the way he moved. There was a restless, coiled energy in his muscles. And as he drew closer, the freezing air of the ballroom carried a new scent. It cut through the expensive perfumes and the spilled alcohol. It was sharp. It was metallic. It was the smell of fresh blood. I saw it then. A dark, wet smudge of crimson on the pristine white cuff of his shirt. A shadow of violence that clung to his knuckles. He had just destroyed someone. He had just taken a life, or ruined one, and now he was walking through a high society gala as if he owned the very air we were breathing. He stopped in the center of the room. The silence was absolute. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The wealthy elites held their breath, terrified that a single sound would draw his attention. Victor slowly turned his head. He surveyed the ballroom. His face was a mask of chilling restraint. He looked at the plastic, starving socialites. He looked at the trembling hedge fund managers. His upper lip curled in a microscopic sneer of pure disgust. He hated them. He hated this fake, gilded world. And then, his eyes found mine. The moment his gaze locked onto me, the rest of the ballroom ceased to exist. The crystal chandeliers, the trembling billionaires, the freezing air, it all vanished. There was only him, and there was only me. His eyes were a dark, stormy gray. They hit me with the physical force of a shockwave. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white, trying to anchor myself against the sudden, terrifying gravity of his stare. He did not look past me. He did not look at me with the pity or disgust I was so used to. He looked at me with a starving, violent intensity. His eyes tracked over my face. They dropped to my throat. They traced the heavy, generous curves of my body hidden beneath the cheap black uniform. He took in my wide hips, my thick thighs, the soft, unapologetic reality of my flesh. In a room full of starving ghosts, I was the only thing breathing. I saw a muscle feather in his jaw. I saw his chest expand as he took a slow, deep breath. He was smelling the air. He was smelling the vanilla bean, the bergamot, and the spun sugar that clung to my skin. He took a step toward me. Kieran, his enforcer, shifted slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his cold face. This was not the plan. Victor was breaking protocol, but Kieran did not speak. Nobody spoke. Victor walked toward my dessert station. Every step he took felt like a hammer striking an anvil. The crowd parted wider, giving him a massive berth. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to hide in the kitchen, to escape the terrifying focus of this apex predator. But my feet were glued to the marble floor. I could not look away from his stormy gray eyes. He stopped directly in front of my table. Up close, he was even more massive. He towered over me, casting a long, dark shadow that swallowed me whole. The scent of him was overwhelming. It was a mixture of expensive bergamot cologne, dark tobacco, and the undeniable raw copper scent of fresh blood. He stood so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. The claustrophobia of his presence was absolute. He was invading my space, trapping me between the heavy wooden table and the wall. He did not say a word. He just stared down at me. His gaze was heavy, possessive, and deeply unsettling. It was the look of a man who had spent his entire life in the freezing dark, suddenly finding a fire. He looked at my curves not with lust, but with a terrifying reverence. I swallowed hard. My throat was bone dry. I tried to maintain my professional armor. I tried to pretend that he was just another wealthy guest. "Good evening, sir," I whispered. My voice trembled, betraying my fear. "Would you like a pastry?" Victor did not answer. He slowly lowered his gaze to the table. His massive, scarred hand reached out. His knuckles were bruised, the skin split and stained with dried blood. He bypassed the delicate spun sugar cages. He bypassed the gold leaf macarons. He picked up a single dark chocolate truffle. He brought it to his lips. He did not break eye contact with me. He placed the truffle in his mouth and ate it slowly. The silence between us was deafening. The entire ballroom was watching us, holding their collective breath, waiting to see what the monster would do to the invisible catering girl. Victor swallowed. A dark, dangerous satisfaction flickered in his eyes. "You made this," he said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone. It possessed a gravelly texture that vibrated right through my chest. It was not a question. It was a statement of absolute certainty. "Yes, sir," I managed to say. My voice barely above a whisper. He took a half step closer. The edge of the table pressed hard against my stomach. I leaned back, but there was nowhere to go. My shoulders hit the wall. "You are trembling," he noted. His voice was chillingly calm. "I am working, sir," I replied, trying to summon a shred of defiance. I lifted my chin, refusing to cower completely. "I have a job to do." A microscopic smirk touched the corner of his mouth. It was a terrifying expression. He recognized my defiance. He recognized that beneath my fear, I was refusing to shrink for him. He reached out again. This time, he did not reach for a pastry. He picked up a heavy crystal whiskey glass from the edge of my station. It had been left behind by one of the hedge fund managers. The glass was thick, expensive, and solid. Victor held the glass in his right hand. He rested his forearm on the table, leaning his massive frame closer to me. The scent of copper and bergamot wrapped around my throat like a velvet rope. "You do not belong in this room," Victor said softly. His voice was meant only for me. It was a dark, possessive rumble. "These people are plastic. They are starving. You are entirely too real to be serving them." I felt a flush of heat rise to my cheeks. No one had ever spoken to me like this. No one had ever looked at my body and called it real. They had only ever called it wrong. "I need this job," I whispered, my eyes darting nervously to Kieran, who was watching the exchange with cold, calculating eyes. Victor ignored my words. He tilted his head, studying my face with a terrifying intensity. He was mapping my features. He was memorizing the exact shade of my eyes, the curve of my jaw, the rapid pulse beating frantically at the base of my throat. "Tell me," Victor murmured, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "Do you belong to anyone?" The question hit me like a physical blow. It was so blunt, so incredibly invasive, that my mind short-circuited. Do I belong to anyone? He was not asking if I was dating. He was asking about ownership. He was asking if there was another man standing in his way. My mind raced. I thought of my empty apartment. I thought of the crushing loneliness of my daily grind. And then, a single image flashed in my mind. Jasper. I thought of Jasper's warm smile in the hallway. I thought of his hand brushing my shoulder. I thought of the promise of a normal life, a safe life, with a man who smiled instead of scowled. I looked up into Victor's terrifying, stormy eyes. I wanted to push him away. I wanted to build a wall between my fragile hope and his violent reality. "Not yet," I answered. The words hung in the freezing air. Victor's eyes went completely dead. The microscopic smirk vanished from his lips. The terrifying reverence in his gaze was instantly replaced by a godlike, apocalyptic fury. The temperature in the immediate space around us seemed to plummet to absolute zero. He did not yell. He did not move abruptly, but his massive right hand, the hand holding the heavy crystal whiskey glass, suddenly clenched. The muscles in his forearm corded like thick steel cables. The veins in his neck bulged. With a sickening, violent crunch, the thick crystal shattered in his bare hand. I gasped, jumping back against the wall. Shards of jagged glass bit deep into his palm. Blood instantly erupted from the wounds. It poured over his scarred knuckles. It dripped heavily onto the pristine white linen of my table. It pooled around the delicate spun sugar, staining the gold leaf a violent crimson. He did not blink. He did not flinch. He did not even look at his ruined hand. He only stared down at me with eyes like a frozen ocean. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. Kieran took a sudden step forward, his hand dropping toward the inside of his tailored jacket. But Victor raised his left hand, a silent, absolute command for his men to stay back. Blood was flowing freely now, dripping off the edge of the table and splashing onto the Italian marble floor. The sheer violence of the act, the absolute disregard for his own pain, paralyzed me. He had crushed solid crystal because of 2 words. Not yet. My professional armor shattered. My instincts took over. I was a working-class woman who spent her life fixing things, cleaning up messes, and surviving. Without thinking, I grabbed a clean, heavy linen napkin from the stack beside my pastries. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I reached out and gently took his massive, bleeding hand. Victor went completely rigid. The moment my soft, flour-dusted fingers touched his scarred, violent knuckles, a violent shudder ripped through his massive frame. He stared at our joined hands as if he had never felt a human touch before. I carefully opened his fingers. The glass had cut deep. The blood was warm and slick. I pressed the thick white linen into his palm, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. My hands were shaking violently. His hand was as steady as a stone. I looked up at him. My eyes were wide with fear and confusion. "You are bleeding," I whispered, stating the obvious, my voice trembling uncontrollably. Victor slowly leaned in. He ignored the blood. He ignored the pain. He ignored the hundreds of terrified wealthy elites watching us in absolute silence. He leaned down until his face was inches from mine. The scent of copper and bergamot was suffocating. I could feel the heat of his breath against my cheek. I could see the dark, terrifying obsession cementing in his stormy eyes. He looked at my lips. He looked at my trembling hands holding his bleeding palm. Then, he leaned his mouth right next to my ear. "Whoever this man is," Victor whispered, his gravelly voice vibrating with a dark, absolute promise. "He is already a ghost." Before I could process the sheer terror of his words, Victor pulled his hand from my grasp. He took the blood-soaked linen napkin with him. He turned his back on me. He did not look at anyone else in the room. He simply walked toward the heavy oak doors, his men falling into perfect formation behind him. I stood frozen behind my dessert station. My hands were stained with his blood. My heart was hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. I watched as the heavy doors swung shut behind him, swallowing the apex predator back into the shadows of Boston. The freezing air of the ballroom rushed back in, but the suffocating weight of his presence remained. I looked down at the shattered crystal and the violent crimson stains ruining my delicate pastries. I did not know it yet, but my invisible, grueling life was over. The monster had seen me in the dark, and he was never going to look away. I spent the rest of that night standing over the deep industrial sink in the hotel kitchen, scrubbing my hands with scalding water and harsh chemical soap. I scrubbed until my skin was raw and glowing red. But no matter how hard I pressed the rough bristles of the brush into my palms, I could not wash away the phantom heat of his blood. The memory of his stormy gray eyes followed me out of the historic Back Bay Hotel. It followed me onto the freezing, empty platform of the subway. It sat beside me on the rattling train car as I rode back to my tiny, overpriced apartment in the dark. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sickening crunch of the heavy crystal whiskey glass shattering in his bare hand. I saw the violent crimson pooling over the delicate gold leaf of my pastries. By 5 a.m, I gave up on sleep. I tied my heavy apron around my waist and walked through the bitter morning chill to the commercial kitchen in South Boston. This was my sanctuary. The chaotic, stainless steel trenches of the catering company were grueling, but they made sense. The rules here were simple. You work until your bones ache. You produce perfection. And you survive another day. The air in the kitchen was already thick with the heavy, comforting scent of melting dark chocolate, brown butter, and active yeast. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glare over the massive metal prep tables. I stood at my station, aggressively kneading a massive mound of brioche dough. I threw my entire body weight into the motion. I used the physical labor to ground myself, trying to push the terrifying apex predator out of my mind. I told myself that he was just a dangerous man passing through my invisible world. I told myself that men who wore bespoke charcoal suits and commanded rooms with absolute silence did not care about plus-size pastry chefs. I was a ghost to his kind. The encounter was just a bizarre, terrifying anomaly. I was desperately trying to convince myself of this lie when I heard footsteps approaching my station. "You are in early, Maeve." I stopped kneading. I looked up and felt a sudden, desperate wave of relief wash over my exhausted body. It was Jasper. He was standing on the other side of the stainless steel table, holding 2 steaming paper cups of coffee. He wore a perfectly fitted plaid button-down shirt, the sleeves casually rolled up to expose his forearms. His blonde hair was slightly tousled, giving him that effortless, approachable tech bro aesthetic that made everyone in the kitchen trust him instantly. Jasper smiled. It was the same slow, warm smile he had given me in the hallway the night before. The smile that made me feel like I actually mattered. "I brought you a latte," Jasper said softly. He walked around the table and set the cup down near my flour-dusted cutting board. Oat milk, 2 pumps of vanilla, Just the way you like it. I wiped my forehead with the back of my wrist, leaving a streak of white flour across my skin. Thank you, Jasper. You did not have to do that. I wanted to, he replied. He leaned his hip against the metal table, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with those bright, attentive blue eyes. You left the gala in a hurry last night. The cleanup crew said your dessert station was a mess. Broken glass everywhere. Did something happen? My stomach tightened. The phantom heat of the blood flared in my palms again. I looked down at the brioche dough. I felt a strange, inexplicable instinct to protect the memory of the monster. I did not want to talk about the man with the stormy gray eyes. I did not want to bring his dark, violent reality into the bright, fluorescent safety of my kitchen. It was nothing, I lied, keeping my voice perfectly level. One of the hedge fund managers had too much to drink. He dropped his glass on my table. It startled me, so I clocked out early. Jasper tilted his head. He watched me carefully. For a fraction of a second, the warm, progressive charm in his eyes flickered, replaced by something sharp and calculating. But the expression vanished so quickly I thought I had imagined it. Are you sure? Jasper pressed, his voice dropping to a gentle, comforting murmur. He reached out and lightly touched my forearm. You know you can tell me anything, right? If one of those billionaire creeps harassed you, I can report it. I look out for my people, Maeve. His touch was light. It was safe. It was the exact opposite of the suffocating, possessive gravity of the man from the ballroom. But as Jasper's fingers brushed my skin, I felt absolutely nothing. No spark, no flutter in my chest. The contrast was jarring. I am fine, Jasper. Really, I insisted, pulling my arm back slightly to resume kneading the dough. Just exhausted. The corporate retreats are always a nightmare. Jasper held his hands up in a gesture of surrender, offering a self-deprecating laugh. Fair enough. I know the grind is brutal, which is exactly why I am officially ordering you to take a break today. I frowned, looking up at him. We have 3 massive events this weekend. I cannot take a break. You can, and you will, Jasper said smoothly. He flashed a brilliant, disarming smile. Let me take you out of this stainless steel dungeon for an hour. There is a new coffee shop in the South End. Let me buy you a real drink this afternoon. Just you and me, away from the chaos. My heart gave a small, hesitant thump. I looked at Jasper. I looked at his kind eyes and his safe, normal posture. I thought about the crushing loneliness of my apartment. I thought about the toxic, starving socialites who looked at my generous curves with disgust. Jasper was handsome. He was successful. And he was standing in a dirty commercial kitchen, asking me out on a date. I desperately wanted to feel normal. I wanted to prove to myself that I belonged in the bright, ordinary world, and not in the terrifying, blood-soaked shadows of the monster who had claimed I was his. Okay, I breathed, offering a small, fragile smile. Okay, Jasper, I would like that. Jasper's smile widened into something triumphant. Perfect. I will meet you out front at 3 o'clock. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing lightly against the tile floor. I watched him go, feeling a desperate sense of hope blooming in my chest. I told myself that this was the beginning of something good. I told myself that I was finally being seen by a good man. I was a fool. While I was standing in the flour-dusted trenches of South Boston, desperately clinging to the illusion of a normal life, a massive storm was gathering in a high-tech penthouse overlooking the city. I would later learn exactly what happened in that room. Kieran, the man with the dead ash eyes, would eventually tell me the truth, long after the blood had dried and the ashes had settled. The penthouse was located in the hyper-gentrified heights of Beacon Hill. It was a sprawling, brutalist masterpiece of black marble, dark leather, and floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass. It was a fortress in the sky, designed for a man who trusted absolutely no one. Victor was standing by the massive glass wall, looking down at the sprawling grid of Boston. He had not slept. He had not changed out of his tailored charcoal suit. His right hand was wrapped in thick, pristine white gauze, concealing the deep lacerations from the shattered crystal. He was completely motionless. He looked like a statue carved from violence and shadow. But beneath his chilling restraint, a monumental psychological rage was boiling. He was thinking about the ballroom. He was thinking about the scent of vanilla bean and bergamot. He was thinking about the soft, unapologetic reality of my curves, and the terrifying, absolute obsession that had taken root in his chest the moment our eyes met. He had spent his entire life operating in a world of plastic, starving socialites and ruthless killers. He had built an empire on fear, control, and calculated brutality. But when I had reached out and wrapped my trembling, flour-dusted fingers around his bleeding hand, His entire universe had fractured. I had not looked at him with the greedy ambition of the women in his world. I had looked at him with genuine, terrified empathy. I was the only real thing he had ever touched. And the moment I had spoken the words "not yet," referring to another man, a dark, possessive instinct had consumed him entirely. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse office swung open. Kieran walked into the room. His footsteps were completely silent against the imported rugs. He carried a thick manila folder in his left hand. His face was a mask of ice-cold, ruthless efficiency. Victor did not turn around. He kept his stormy gray eyes fixed on the city below. "Speak," Victor commanded. His gravelly baritone vibrated against the glass. Kieran stopped a few feet behind him. "We ran the background on the floor manager, the one she mentioned at the gala. His name is Jasper Cole." Victor's massive shoulders tensed. The air in the penthouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. And Kieran opened the manila folder. He did not hesitate. He viewed the world strictly through the lens of threat assessment, and the information he held was a massive, glaring threat. "He is not a floor manager, boss," Kieran said flatly. "His identity is a ghost. The social security number was minted 3 years ago. The college transcripts are deep-faked. We pulled a favor from our contact inside the federal courthouse." Kieran paused, letting the silence hang in the freezing air. "Jasper Cole is a special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He has been operating deep undercover for 6 months. Victor slowly turned around. His face was completely blank. There was no shock. There was no outward display of anger, but the psychological shift in the room was monumental. It was the terrifying calm of an ocean pulling back right before a tsunami hits the shore. "Explain," Victor whispered. The sound was darker than night. Kieran looked down at the dossier. "The Bureau is trying to map our supply chains. They know we use the elite catering company to service our private meetings and VIP events. Cole infiltrated the company to get access to the guest lists and the floor plans." Victor stared at his enforcer. His stormy gray eyes were completely dead. "Why is he talking to her?" "Because she is the lead pastry chef," Kieran answered, his voice devoid of emotion. "She has all access clearance to the VIP floors. She is the one who personally delivers the high-end orders to the private suites." Cole identified her as a vulnerable target. A working-class woman, isolated, struggling with debt. He is weaponizing a romantic narrative to manipulate her. He is using her as a blind pawn to get closer to you. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. Victor looked down at his bandaged right hand. He thought about Jasper Cole. He thought about this cynical, ambitious federal agent pretending to want my lush, generous curves. He thought about this parasite using my deep, unspoken loneliness as a weapon to destroy his empire. The rage that hit Victor was not just anger. It was a godlike, possessive fury. Jasper Cole was not a rival suitor. He was a threat to the only pure thing Victor had ever found. Cole had looked at my absolute perfection and seen nothing but a pathetic, gullible tool. Victor walked slowly toward his massive black marble desk. He did not yell. He did not throw anything. His movements were chillingly precise. "Kieran," Victor said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble of pure death. "Yes, boss. Contact our shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. I want a hostile corporate takeover of the catering company executed immediately." Kieran blinked, a rare flicker of surprise crossing his cold face. "Boss, that company is valued at $40 million. A hostile takeover will draw massive attention from the Securities and Exchange Commission." "I do not care," Victor stated, his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Buy the board. Liquidate the assets. Threaten the shareholders. I want total, undisputed ownership of her employment contract within the hour. She belongs to me now. The ground she walks on belongs to me." Kieran nodded slowly, recognizing the absolute finality in Victor's tone. "Understood. And what about the federal agent?" Victor looked up. His eyes were black with violent promise. "Find out where he is taking her," Victor whispered. "And assemble the men. We are going to remind the federal government exactly who owns this city." At 3 o'clock that afternoon, I stepped out of the commercial kitchen and into the gray, overcast streets of Boston. A cold drizzle was beginning to fall, slicking the cobblestones and casting a gloomy shadow over the city. I had changed out of my heavy apron and tight uniform. I was wearing a soft, oversized maroon sweater and dark jeans. I felt incredibly self-conscious. I tugged at the hem of my sweater, trying to hide the generous curve of my hips, wishing I could shrink myself down to fit the societal mold of a perfect date. Jasper was waiting for me under the awning of the building. He held a large black umbrella. He smiled when he saw me, stepping forward to shield me from the rain. "You look great, Maeve," he said smoothly. "Thank you," I murmured, feeling a blush rise to my cheeks. We walked together to a trendy, overpriced coffee shop in the South End. The cafe was packed with wealthy college students, remote tech workers typing on silver laptops, and young professionals escaping the rain. The air smelled of roasted espresso beans, damp wool, and expensive perfume. We found a small wooden table near the back window. The rain was streaking heavily against the glass now, blurring the city outside. Jasper ordered us 2 matcha lattes. He sat across from me, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. He gave me his full, undivided attention. For the first 10 minutes, the conversation was normal. We talked about the grueling hours of the kitchen. We talked about the ridiculous demands of the wealthy clients. I started to relax. I started to let my guard down, believing the beautiful lie that this handsome, successful man was genuinely interested in my life. But then, the atmosphere shifted. Jasper took a sip of his latte. He set the cup down and looked at me, his blue eyes suddenly sharp and focused. "So," Jasper said, his voice dropping to a casual, conversational tone. "About last night, at the gala." My stomach tightened. The phantom heat flared in my palms again. "I told you, Jasper. It was nothing." I know, Jasper said quickly, holding up a hand. "But I was reviewing the security logs this morning. The cameras in the ballroom malfunctioned right around 11:15, right when you clocked out, and the cleanup crew said the glass on your table was not dropped. It was crushed." I stared at him. The warm, progressive charm was completely gone from his face. He looked intense. He looked hungry. "Why are you looking at security logs?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Jasper ignored my question. He leaned closer across the small wooden table. He lowered his voice, making sure the people at the neighboring tables could not hear him. "Maeve, the man who was standing at your station. The tall guy in the charcoal suit. Did he say anything to you? Did he mention any names? Did he talk about the shipping ports?" A cold spike of dread drove itself directly into my chest. I looked at Jasper. I looked at the man I thought was my friend. The man I thought was a safe harbor. He was not looking at my face. He was not looking at my body. He was looking right through me, searching for a piece of information that I did not understand. "I do not know what you are talking about," I whispered, pressing my back against the wooden chair, trying to put distance between us. Jasper's jaw clenched. The soft boy mask slipped entirely, revealing something cynical, ambitious, and deeply cruel underneath. He reached across the table. He grabbed my wrist. It was not a gentle touch. It was a firm, controlling, aggressive grip. His fingers dug into my skin, pinning my arm to the table. "Do not play dumb with me, Maeve," Jasper hissed, his voice suddenly harsh and demanding. "I know he spoke to you. I know he touched you. You are the only person he interacted with all night. I need you to tell me exactly what he said. Right now." Panic seized my throat. I tried to pull my wrist away, but his grip was like a vice. "Jasper, you are hurting me. Let go. Tell me what he said," Jasper demanded, his eyes flashing with desperate anger. I opened my mouth to scream for help, but before a single sound could leave my lips, the atmosphere in the crowded cafe violently, terrifyingly shattered. The heavy glass door at the front of the shop did not open with a polite ring of the bell. It was shoved open with bone-shattering force. The metal hinges screamed in protest as the door slammed against the brick wall. The noisy hum of the cafe died instantly. The barista froze with a pitcher of steamed milk in her hand. The tech workers stopped typing. 3 massive men in tailored black suits stepped into the shop. They moved with the synchronized, hyper-vigilant grace of wolves. One of them reached out, flipped the open sign to closed, and threw the heavy metal deadbolt, locking us all inside. The air in the room plummeted to absolute zero. Then, he walked in. Victor. He was wearing a long black cashmere trench coat over his dark suit. The heavy rain glistened on his broad shoulders and in his dark hair. He looked like a god of war stepping onto a battlefield. The sheer, suffocating gravity of his presence crushed the oxygen out of the room. The wealthy college students and young professionals shrank back into their booths, terrified by the sudden, primal violence radiating from the massive man at the door. Victor did not look at them. He did not look at the barista. His stormy gray eyes swept the room and locked instantly onto our table in the back. He saw Jasper. And he saw Jasper's hand wrapped aggressively around my wrist, the muscle in Victor's jaw feathered. He moved with blinding, terrifying speed. He did not walk. He stalked across the cafe like an apex predator closing in on a kill. He bypassed the empty tables, his heavy footsteps echoing like gunshots in the dead silence of the room. Jasper saw him coming. The federal agent's eyes went wide with sudden, absolute panic. He realized instantly that he had miscalculated. He realized that he had pushed too hard. And now the monster was here. Jasper let go of my wrist. He scrambled backward, trying to stand up, his hand reaching frantically beneath his plaid shirt toward his waistband. He never even got close. Victor reached our table. He did not say a word. He did not issue a threat. He simply reached out with his massive, uninjured left hand. He grabbed Jasper by the front of his shirt and the lapel of his jacket. With a terrifying roar of physical power, Victor lifted the undercover agent entirely out of the booth. He hoisted Jasper into the air as if the man weighed absolutely nothing. Victor hurled him across the room. Jasper flew backward through the air. He crashed violently into a heavy wooden dining table in the center of the cafe. The table shattered into jagged splinters under the impact. Coffee cups exploded, sending hot liquid and ceramic shards flying across the floor. Screams erupted from the terrified customers. People scrambled over chairs, pressing themselves against the brick walls, desperate to escape the violence. Jasper groaned, rolling over in the wreckage of the table. He was a trained federal agent, but he was nothing compared to the raw, unadulterated brutality of the syndicate boss. Jasper tried to push himself up, his hand desperately clawing for the concealed weapon at his hip. Victor did not give him the chance. He closed the distance in 2 massive strides. He kicked the gun out of Jasper's hand, sending the heavy black pistol skittering across the floor. Then, Victor reached down. He wrapped his massive, corded left hand directly around Jasper's throat. He lifted the federal agent straight off the floor. Jasper's feet dangled in the air, kicking frantically against Victor's shins. His hands clawed desperately at Victor's thick wrist, trying to pry the massive fingers away from his windpipe. But Victor's grip was absolute. It was a vice of solid marble. Jasper's face began to turn a deep, mottled purple. His eyes bulged with sheer terror. He was suffocating. He was dying. Victor stood perfectly still, holding the man in the air. His face was a mask of chilling, apocalyptic fury. He was going to snap the agent's neck. He was going to murder a federal officer in the middle of a crowded coffee shop, in broad daylight. And he did not care who saw it. I was paralyzed. I was pressed back against the wall of my booth, trembling violently. I had never seen real violence before. I had never seen a man pushed to the absolute brink of murder. But as I watched Jasper's eyes roll back in his head, my paralysis broke. I could not let him do it. I could not let the monster destroy himself in front of me. I scrambled out of the booth. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I stumbled across the floor, my boots slipping on the spilled coffee and shattered ceramic. I reached Victor. I did not yell. I did not scream. I knew that words would not penetrate the godlike rage consuming his mind. I reached out with both of my trembling hands. I wrapped my fingers around his massive, corded forearm. The muscle beneath his tailored sleeve felt like hot iron. "Victor," I whispered, my voice cracking with absolute terror. "Please, stop." The effect was instantaneous. The moment my soft, trembling hands touched his arm, the apocalyptic fury in his stormy gray eyes faltered. A violent shudder ripped through his massive frame, exactly like the night before in the ballroom. He stopped looking at the dying man in his grasp. He slowly turned his head and looked down at me. He looked at my wide, terrified eyes. He looked at my hands clinging desperately to his arm. The terrifying, absolute obsession flooded back into his gaze. I was his anchor. I was the only thing in the world that could pull him back from the dark. Victor opened his hand. Jasper collapsed to the floor in a heap of bruised limbs and torn fabric. The federal agent gasped violently, clutching his bruised throat, coughing and retching as oxygen flooded back into his lungs. Victor did not look at him again. He turned his entire massive body toward me. Before I could take a step back, Victor wrapped his thick arm around my waist. He pulled me flush against his solid, heat-radiating chest. The claustrophobia of his presence was overwhelming. The scent of rain, dark tobacco, and bergamot wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. "We are leaving," Victor rumbled. His gravelly voice vibrated right through my ribs. He did not wait for my answer. He turned and dragged me toward the front door of the cafe. His men immediately fell into formation around us, forming a human shield of tailored suits and concealed weapons. We burst out of the coffee shop and into the freezing, torrential rain. A massive, armored black SUV was idling aggressively at the curb, its hazard lights flashing. Kieran was standing by the open back door, the rain soaking his dark suit. He did not look at me. He only scanned the street for threats. Victor shoved me gently but firmly into the cavernous backseat of the SUV. He climbed in right behind me. The heavy, bulletproof door slammed shut. The vault-like thud sealed us inside a dark, soundproof world of rich leather and tinted glass. The SUV accelerated instantly, the massive engine roaring as it tore away from the curb. The force threw me back against the plush leather seat. I was hyperventilating. My chest heaved as I stared at the man sitting beside me. The rain was dripping from his dark hair, tracing the sharp, violent angles of his jaw. "Are you insane?" I gasped, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and outrage. "He was just a manager. He was my friend. You almost killed him." Victor slowly turned his head. He looked at me with a mixture of dark devotion and deep, agonizing pity. "He is not your friend, Maeve," Victor said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that filled the claustrophobic space. "His name is Special Agent Jasper Cole. He is the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I froze. The words hung in the dark air of the SUV, refusing to make sense in my exhausted mind. "What?" I breathed. Victor shifted closer to me. His massive frame dominated the back seat. "He has been mapping my supply chains for 6 months. He targeted you because you had all access clearance to the VIP events. He used your loneliness. He used your heart." Victor reached out with his bandaged right hand. He did not touch me, but his fingers hovered inches from my cheek, radiating heat. "He looked at your absolute perfection," Victor whispered, his voice thick with possessive rage, "and he saw nothing but a pathetic, gullible pawn." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Every warm smile, every gentle touch in the hallway, every word of validation that had made me feel seen, made me feel beautiful. It was all a cynical, calculated lie. Jasper did not see me. He did not want me. He was just another man in a long line of men who looked at my generous curves and decided I was weak, desperate, and easy to manipulate. He had weaponized my deepest insecurities just to get a badge of honor from his superiors. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes. A suffocating wave of humiliation crashed over me. I wrapped my arms tightly around my waist, suddenly feeling incredibly exposed, foolish, and utterly worthless. I turned my face away, staring out the tinted window at the blurred city lights, trying to hide my tears from the monster beside me. But Victor would not let me hide. He reached out. His large, warm fingers gently grasped my chin. He turned my face back toward him with an unstoppable, reverent force. "Do not hide from me," Victor commanded softly. His stormy gray eyes were burning with a dark, unwavering fire. He was a blind fool who played with a diamond because he thought it was glass. "But I see you, Maeve. I see exactly what you are." I looked up at him, a single tear escaping and tracking down my cheek. "What do you want from me?" Victor leaned in. His face was inches from mine. The terrifying intensity of his gaze stripped away every defense I had left. "Everything," Victor answered. The absolute certainty in his gravelly voice made my heart stop. "I want your mornings. I want your nights. I want the flower on your hands and the heavy beat of your heart. You are the only empire worth dying for, Maeve. And I am going to burn the rest of the world to the ground, just to keep you warm." I trembled violently. I had no words left. I was completely consumed by the dark, terrifying gravity of his devotion. I looked past his broad shoulders, out the front windshield of the armored SUV. The concrete grid of Boston was gone. We were driving deep into the dense, ancient woods of Weston. The trees were massive, their bare branches clawing at the dark, stormy sky. Suddenly, massive iron gates loomed in the heavy rain. They were heavily fortified, flanked by stone pillars and security cameras. As the SUV approached, the gates swung open automatically, revealing a sprawling, brutalist luxury estate hidden deep among the trees. The SUV passed through the threshold. Behind us, the heavy iron gates clanged shut. The sound echoed through the wet woods like the door of a massive vault locking into place. I sat frozen in the leather seat, the terrifying reality of my situation finally crashing down on me. I was not a guest being rescued from a cruel world. I was a captive queen being brought to her gilded cage, and outside the bulletproof glass, a massive, violent storm was only just beginning to break. The heavy tires of the armored vehicle crunched over the wet gravel driveway, pulling up to the massive stone steps of the estate. I sat frozen in the leather seat, the terrifying reality of my situation finally crashing down on me. I was not a guest being rescued from a cruel world. I was a captive queen being brought to her gilded cage. And outside the bulletproof glass, a massive, violent storm was only just beginning to break. The heavy door of the SUV was pulled open from the outside. The freezing rain immediately whipped into the cabin, carrying the scent of wet pine and crushed leaves. Kieran stood in the downpour, holding a massive black umbrella. His dead ash eyes scanned the dark tree line with hyper-vigilant precision. He did not look at me. He simply held the door, waiting. Victor shifted beside me. He stepped out into the storm first, ignoring the umbrella. He turned and offered me his massive, uninjured left hand. I stared at his palm. I thought about the violence that hand had just inflicted on Jasper. I thought about the terrifying ease with which he had lifted a grown man off the floor. But I also thought about the absolute, unwavering devotion in his stormy gray eyes. My hand was trembling as I reached out. The moment my fingers brushed his grip tightened. It was not a painful grip. It was a deeply possessive, anchoring hold. He pulled me gently from the vehicle and guided me up the stone steps. The front doors of the mansion were made of solid, reinforced steel, disguised as dark, heavy oak. They swung open silently, revealing the cavernous interior of the brutalist estate. The house was a fortress of black marble, dark leather, and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the impenetrable woods. It was breathtakingly expensive, but it was completely devoid of warmth. It looked exactly like the man who owned it, cold, calculating, and built to withstand a siege. Victor led me into the massive foyer. The heavy steel doors clicked shut behind us, sealing out the sound of the torrential rain. The silence inside the house was absolute. "Kieran," Victor commanded, his gravelly voice echoing off the marble walls. "Yes, boss," Kieran replied, stepping into the foyer and shaking the water from his dark suit. "Double the perimeter guard. Nobody gets within a mile of this property without my authorization. If a federal vehicle approaches the gate, you do not ask questions, you disable it." Kieran nodded once, his face a mask of ruthless efficiency. "Understood." Victor turned his attention back to me. He looked down at my wet hair and my damp, oversized maroon sweater. The fierce, apocalyptic rage that had consumed him in the coffee shop was gone, replaced by a heavy, brooding intensity. "You are shivering," he murmured. "I am fine," I lied, wrapping my arms around my generous curves, suddenly feeling incredibly small in the massive, echoing space. "You are not fine," Victor corrected softly. "You have been betrayed. You have been dragged into a world you do not understand, and you are terrified of me." I looked up into his eyes. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to summon the quiet, stubborn armor I wore every day in the commercial kitchen. But the truth was written all over my trembling frame. "Are you going to keep me here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor reached out. He gently brushed a wet strand of hair away from my cheek. His knuckles grazed my skin, sending a jolt of heat straight to my chest. "I'm going to keep you safe," Victor answered. The distinction was subtle, but the absolute finality in his tone left no room for argument. "The federal government knows who you are now. Jasper Cole will not stop. He is an ambitious, cynical climber. He will use you to get to me, and when he is done, he will throw you to the wolves." Victor stepped closer. The claustrophobia of his presence wrapped around me like a heavy velvet cloak. "This house is the only safe place left for you, Maeve. You have the run of the estate. You can go anywhere you please, but you will not walk out those front doors." He did not wait for my permission. He did not ask for my understanding. He simply stated the new reality of my existence. For the next 5 days, I lived in the gilded cage. The psychological tension in the house was suffocating. I was a working-class woman who had spent her entire life exhausted by the modern American grind. I was used to 14-hour shifts, crushing debt, and the constant toxic pressure of a society that belittled my body. Suddenly, I had nothing to do. I had no shifts to work. I had no bills to pay. I was surrounded by untouchable wealth, trapped in a hyper-fortified mansion with a syndicate boss who watched my every move. To cope with the overwhelming anxiety, I retreated to the only place that made sense to me, the kitchen. Victor's kitchen was a culinary masterpiece. It was larger than my entire apartment, outfitted with imported Italian marble countertops, dual industrial ovens, and every high-end tool a pastry chef could ever dream of. I started baking. On the first day, I made a simple braided brioche. I threw my entire body weight into kneading the dough, using the physical labor to push the memory of Jasper's betrayal out of my mind. I thought about the undercover agent. I thought about how easily he had weaponized my deep, unspoken loneliness. He had looked at my plus-size figure and assumed I was desperate for validation. He had assumed I would be a pathetic, gullible pawn. The humiliation burned in my chest like a hot coal. I kneaded the dough harder, my knuckles aching, tears of frustration stinging my eyes. When I finally pulled the golden, steaming brioche from the oven, I turned around and gasped. Victor was standing in the doorway. I had no idea how long he had been there. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a ghost. He was wearing a dark Henley shirt and tailored slacks. His massive frame filled the doorframe entirely. He did not say a word. He simply walked across the kitchen, his stormy gray eyes fixed on me. He stopped in front of the marble island. He looked at the fresh bread. Then, he looked at my flour-dusted hands. Without asking, Victor reached out and broke off a piece of the steaming brioche. He brought it to his mouth and ate it slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. The silence between us was heavy and thick. It was not the cold, dismissive silence of the wealthy elites I used to serve. It was a deeply attentive, reverent silence. He swallowed. A dark, dangerous satisfaction flickered in his gaze. "Perfect," he whispered. Then, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me trembling beside the oven. This became our silent ritual. On the second day, I made dark chocolate truffles dusted with sea salt and gold leaf. Victor appeared in the doorway just as I was finishing the delicate sugar work. He walked over, picked up a truffle, and ate it from the palm of his hand. On the third day, I made a complex, multi-layered opera cake. The scent of espresso, almond sponge, and rich ganache filled the cold, brutalist mansion. Victor sat on one of the heavy leather bar stools at the island. He watched me work for 2 solid hours. He did not look at his phone. He did not take any meetings. He simply watched me. He watched the way my hips swayed as I moved between the counter and the fridge. He watched the way my thick thighs pressed against the marble as I leaned over to pipe the frosting. He watched my generous curves with a starving, unapologetic intensity. The women in his world were sharp angles and hollow cheeks. They starved themselves to fit into a plastic mold. But Victor looked at my lush, heavy reality as if I were the only true thing he had ever seen. The psychological shift inside me was slow, but it was undeniable. The fear of his violence began to recede, replaced by a dark, intoxicating realization. This man controlled the criminal underworld of New England. He commanded an army of ruthless killers. He could snap a federal agent's neck without a second thought. Yet, he sat in my kitchen, waiting patiently for me to hand him a piece of cake. He was proving his total submission to me. He was eating everything I made, taking the nourishment I provided, and letting me see the terrifying depth of his devotion. He was not starving me. He was worshipping me. By the 5th day, the tension between my lingering fear and my awakening desire had reached a boiling point. The weather outside had deteriorated completely. A massive, torrential storm had rolled in off the Atlantic. The wind howled through the ancient woods of Weston, violently thrashing the bare branches against the bulletproof glass of the mansion. It was late in the evening. The house was plunged into shadows, illuminated only by the dim, warm lights of the kitchen and the occasional, jagged flash of lightning. I was standing at the marble island, aggressively whisking a bowl of heavy cream. The rhythmic sound of the metal whisk hitting the glass bowl was the only thing keeping me grounded. The heavy oak doors of the kitchen swung open. Victor walked in. He looked different tonight. The chilling restraint that usually masked his features was gone. He looked exhausted. The dark circles under his stormy gray eyes spoke of sleepless nights and brutal, unseen wars. He walked slowly across the kitchen. He did not stop on the other side of the marble island. He walked entirely around it, invading my space. I stopped whisking. My breath caught in my throat. The scent of rain, dark tobacco, and bergamot wrapped around me, suffocating and familiar. Victor stopped right behind me. He was so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his massive chest. Slowly, heavily, he leaned forward. He rested his forehead against the curve of my shoulder. The physical contact sent a violent shockwave through my entire body. He was a man built of solid marble and violence, yet he was resting his heavy head against my soft, generous curves, as if I were the only safe harbor in the world. I froze. My hands gripped the edge of the marble counter. I could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart pressing against my back. "Victor," I whispered, my voice trembling in the quiet kitchen. "He went rogue," Victor murmured. His gravelly voice vibrated directly against my collarbone. I turned my head slightly, trying to look at him. "Who?" "Jasper Cole," Victor answered, the name dripping with dark, venomous disgust. "The Bureau pulled his undercover status after the incident at the cafe. They told him to stand down, but his ego is bruised. He cannot handle the fact that a working-class pastry chef and a syndicate boss humiliated him." Victor lifted his head. He placed his massive, scarred hands on my waist. His grip was firm, possessive and incredibly warm. He slowly turned me around to face him. Jasper burned his federal badge, Victor continued, his stormy eyes locking onto mine. He crossed the line. He teamed up with a rival cartel from the south side. They want my territory. Jasper wants revenge. He wants to prove that he can break the monster, and he wants to punish you for choosing the dark over his fake progressive light. A cold spike of dread drove itself into my stomach. What does that mean? Before Victor could answer, the entire mansion violently shuddered. A massive, deafening explosion echoed from the front gates. The sound was so loud it rattled the heavy pots and pans hanging above the kitchen island. Instantly, the warm lights of the kitchen died. The mansion was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. A second later, the emergency backup generators kicked in. Low, pulsing red lights illuminated the hallways, casting long, bloody shadows across the imported marble floors. The heavy oak doors of the kitchen burst open. Kieran sprinted into the room. His tailored suit jacket was gone. He was holding a suppressed tactical submachine gun. His dead ash eyes were wide with adrenaline. "The perimeter is breached," Kieran shouted over the howling wind outside. They blew the main gate. "We have 3 heavily armed cartel vehicles coming up the driveway. Jasper Cole is leading them." The vulnerability in Victor's eyes vanished instantly. The exhausted man who had just rested his head on my shoulder was gone. The apex predator returned. His jaw clenched. His massive shoulders rolled back. The godlike, apocalyptic fury ignited in his gaze. "Hold the main hall," Victor commanded, his voice a terrifying roar of absolute authority. "Do not let them reach the upper floors. Kill every single man who steps foot inside my house." Kieran nodded sharply. He racked the bolt of his weapon and sprinted back out into the red-lit corridor. Victor turned to me. He grabbed my hand. His grip was like a vice of solid steel. "We are moving," Victor stated. He did not wait for me to process the terror. He dragged me out of the kitchen and into the sprawling, chaotic darkness of the mansion. The descent was a nightmare of sensory overload. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne, ozone from the storm, and the sudden, sharp scent of cordite. Suppressed gunfire began to echo through the massive house. It sounded like heavy staples being driven into wood. Jagged flashes of lightning illuminated the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting terrifying, strobe-like silhouettes of Victor's men taking up defensive positions behind the black marble pillars. I stumbled over my own feet, my soft boots slipping on the polished floors. But Victor's grip on my hand never faltered. He pulled me along with blinding, ruthless efficiency. He was a creature born in the dark, navigating the chaos of his own fortress with terrifying ease. We reached a hidden, reinforced steel door at the back of the massive library. Victor slammed his palm against a biometric scanner. The heavy door hissed open, revealing a narrow, concrete stairwell plunging deep underground. "Down," Victor ordered, shoving me gently but firmly onto the first step. We descended into the freezing, claustrophobic depths of the estate. The sound of the gunfire above grew muffled, replaced by the echoing thud of our footsteps on the concrete. At the bottom of the stairs was a massive, underground panic room. It was a bunker built of solid titanium and reinforced concrete. The entrance was protected by a thick, sliding door made of military-grade bulletproof glass. We reached the bottom of the stairs. Victor reached out to hit the control panel to open the glass door. But before his fingers could touch the keypad, the shadows at the far end of the concrete corridor shifted. 3 blindingly bright tactical flashlights clicked on, pinning us against the heavy glass door. I threw my hand up to shield my eyes from the blinding glare. My heart hammered frantically against my ribs. We were trapped. "Well, well, well," a voice echoed down the concrete hallway. It was a voice I recognized. But the warm, progressive charm was completely gone. It was replaced by a deranged, cynical cruelty. Jasper Cole stepped out of the shadows. He was no longer wearing his effortless tech bro plaid shirt. He was wearing black tactical gear. He held a heavy assault rifle, the barrel pointed directly at Victor's chest. Flanking Jasper were 3 massive cartel hitmen. They were covered in gang tattoos, their faces twisted into masks of violent anticipation. They held their weapons steady, their fingers resting dangerously on the triggers. "You built a hell of a fortress, Victor," Jasper mocked, taking a slow, arrogant step forward. "But you forgot one basic rule. Never let a liability slow you down." Victor did not move. He stood perfectly still, his massive frame shielding half of my body. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply stared at the rogue agent with eyes like a frozen ocean. Jasper laughed. It was a cold, ugly sound that echoed off the concrete walls. He lowered his rifle slightly and shifted his gaze to me. The look in Jasper's eyes made my blood run cold. It was the exact same look the starving socialites gave me in the ballroom. It was a look of absolute toxic disgust. "Look at you, Maeve," Jasper sneered, his voice dripping with vicious contempt, hiding behind the monster. "Did you really think this was a fairy tale? Did you really think a man who owns half the city actually wanted you?" I shrank back against the bulletproof glass. The words hit me harder than physical blows. Jasper took another step forward, weaponizing every societal trauma I had ever faced. He dropped the nice guy mask completely, revealing the cruel institutional climber beneath. "You are pathetic," Jasper spat, his voice echoing loudly in the confined space. "You are a fat, insecure whale. You were so desperate for a single drop of attention that you let me map this entire syndicate just by smiling at you. You were the easiest, most gullible mark I have ever played. Nobody wants a woman who takes up that much space. You are nothing but a tool." The silence that followed his words was absolute. I closed my eyes. The humiliation was suffocating. I felt the tears burning, threatening to spill over. Society had always told me I was too much. Jasper was just confirming every dark, terrible fear I held in my heart. But Victor did not shrink. The insult to my body, the vicious attack on my reality, triggered something apocalyptic inside the syndicate boss. The chilling restraint shattered completely. Victor did not yell. He did not argue with the rogue agent. He moved. With terrifying, blinding speed, Victor grabbed my shoulders. He shoved me backward, directly into the open threshold of the panic room. Before I could regain my balance, Victor slammed his fist onto the emergency lockdown button on the outside wall. The massive, thick, bulletproof glass door slid shut with a heavy, vault-like hiss. The magnetic locks engaged with a deafening clack. I was sealed inside the safe room. Victor was locked outside in the concrete corridor, trapped with the wolves. I scrambled to my feet and threw my hands against the thick glass. "Victor!" I screamed, but the soundproof glass swallowed my voice entirely. Jasper raised his assault rifle, a look of panicked confusion crossing his face. He had expected Victor to cower. He had expected Victor to negotiate. He did not expect the god of war to unleash hell. Victor did not draw a gun. He reached to the small of his back and pulled a massive, serrated combat knife from his belt. The dark steel gleamed in the harsh tactical lights. What happened next was a blindingly fast, brutally cinematic massacre. The first cartel hitman raised his weapon to fire. Victor ducked under the barrel with impossible speed. He drove the heavy combat knife directly upward, burying the blade to the hilt under the hitman's jaw. Blood erupted in a violent crimson spray, painting the concrete wall. The second hitman panicked, pulling the trigger wildly. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off the reinforced walls and the bulletproof glass right in front of my face. I flinched, but the glass held. Victor used the dead weight of the first hitman as a shield. He ripped the knife free, spun low, and drove the blade deep into the side of the second hitman's knee. The man screamed, collapsing to the floor. Before he could hit the ground, Victor grabbed the back of his tactical vest and hurled him violently into the third hitman. The corridor devolved into absolute primal carnage. Victor was a force of nature. He moved with a ruthless, terrifying efficiency that defied human logic. He was not fighting for his territory. He was fighting for the absolute sanctity of the woman behind the glass. He disarmed the third hitman with a bone-shattering strike to the wrist. The heavy rifle clattered to the floor. Victor grabbed the man by the throat, lifted him inches off the ground, and slammed his skull backward into the concrete wall with sickening force. In less than 15 seconds, the three heavily armed cartel killers were dead on the floor. The concrete corridor was slick with blood. The metallic scent of copper hung heavy in the air, seeping through the ventilation grates of the panic room. Jasper Cole was left standing alone. The rogue agent's face was completely drained of color. The arrogant, cruel sneer was gone, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. His assault rifle had jammed during the chaos. He fumbled frantically with the bolt, his hands shaking violently. Victor slowly turned to face him. Victor's tailored Henley was soaked in blood. His face was splattered with crimson. His stormy gray eyes were black with a godlike, possessive fury. Jasper dropped the jammed rifle. He took a step back, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Victor, wait," Jasper begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "We can make a deal. I can give you the cartel's supply routes. I can give you everything." Victor did not speak. He stalked forward, his heavy boots splashing in the blood pooling on the floor. Jasper turned to run back up the stairs. Victor lunged. He grabbed Jasper by the back of his tactical vest and hurled him backward. Jasper crashed hard onto the concrete floor, sliding until his back hit the bulletproof glass of the panic room, right at my feet. I looked down through the thick glass at the man who had manipulated me. I felt absolutely no pity. Victor stood over him. He dropped the combat knife. It clattered loudly against the floor. Victor reached down and grabbed Jasper by the collar of his tactical shirt. He hauled the rogue agent to his feet and slammed him brutally against the bulletproof glass. The impact shook the heavy door. Jasper gasped, blood dripping from his nose, his eyes wide with absolute panic. Victor leaned in. He pressed his forearm against Jasper's throat, pinning him to the glass. Then, Victor roared. It was not a scream of anger. It was a primal, terrifying roar of absolute devotion. It was a sound that vibrated through the thick glass and rattled the bones in my chest. "You look at her," Victor roared, his gravelly voice echoing like thunder in the bloody corridor. He grabbed Jasper's jaw and forced the terrified man to look through the glass at me. "You look at her," Victor demanded, his grip tightening until Jasper whimpered in pain. "She is not a pawn. She is not a tool. She is a sovereign queen. Her body is a masterpiece. Her heart is the only pure thing left in this rotting world. She is absolute perfection." Jasper choked, tears of pain and terror streaming down his bruised face. He looked at me through the glass, finally seeing the terrifying reality of the power I held over the monster. "You insulted my empire," Victor whispered, his voice dropping to a dark, venomous hiss. "And now, you are a ghost." Victor pulled his fist back. I did not look away. I watched as Victor delivered a merciless, bone-crushing beating. He broke the rogue agent completely. He shattered the cynical, ambitious climber until Jasper was nothing more than a broken, unconscious heap on the bloody concrete floor. When it was over, the underground corridor fell completely silent. Victor stood amidst the absolute carnage. His knuckles were split and bleeding. His chest heaved with heavy, exhausted breaths. He was a monster covered in the blood of his enemies. Slowly, Victor turned to face the bulletproof glass. He looked at me standing safely inside the pristine white panic room. The godlike fury drained from his stormy gray eyes. The terrifying apex predator vanished, leaving only a man who had burned down the world to protect the woman he worshipped. Victor took a step toward the glass. His legs trembled. He dropped to his knees. The syndicate boss, the man who controlled the city, the man who bowed to absolutely no one, fell to his knees on the blood-soaked concrete. He pressed his bleeding, scarred palm flat against the thick glass. He bowed his head, submitting entirely to my judgment. He was giving me the choice. I was safe inside the bunker. I could wait for his men to clear the house. I could demand to be let go. I could walk away from the blood and the darkness. I looked at the heavy steel button on the inside of the panic room. I thought about the bright, normal world above. I thought about the starving socialites, the grueling commercial kitchens, and the men who smiled while they lied to my face. Then, I looked down at the monster on his knees. He was violent. He was dangerous. But he was the only person in my entire life who had ever looked at my generous curves and seen absolute perfection. He was the only one who saw my true worth. I did not hesitate. I slammed my hand against the heavy steel button. The magnetic locks disengaged with a loud clack. The thick, bulletproof glass door hissed open, breaking the seal between the pristine safe room and the bloody corridor. The heavy scent of copper and bergamot rushed in. I stepped out of the safe room. My soft boots stepped directly into the blood pooling on the concrete. I did not care. I dropped to my knees right in front of him. Victor snapped his head up. His stormy gray eyes were wide with shock. He expected me to run. He expected me to look at him with the same toxic disgust that society had always shown me. Instead, I reached out. I placed my clean, trembling hands on his blood-splattered cheeks. I felt the rough stubble of his jaw. I felt the frantic, heavy pulse beating in his throat. "You are mine," I whispered, my voice steady and absolute in the dark corridor. Victor let out a ragged, broken breath. He lunged forward, wrapping his massive, blood-soaked arms around my waist. He buried his face in the soft curve of my stomach, holding on to me as if I were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. I wrapped my arms around his broad shoulders, pulling the monster close. I embraced the darkness, realizing that in his shadows, I was finally allowed to shine. 6 months later, the world looked very different. The grueling, invisible labor of the commercial kitchen was a distant memory. The cheap, rigid black uniforms were gone. I was standing in the penthouse boardroom of a massive glass skyscraper in the heart of Boston's financial district. I was wearing a tailored, deep emerald suit that perfectly accentuated my wide hips and thick thighs. The fabric was expensive, commanding, and unapologetic. I was no longer a ghost serving the wealthy elite. I was the CEO of my own elite culinary empire. The hostile corporate takeover had been absolute. The men who used to ignore me, the hedge fund managers who used to drop their glasses on my tables, now sat nervously in my boardroom, begging for catering contracts. They looked at me with a mixture of deep respect and undeniable fear. They knew who I was, and more importantly, they knew who stood behind me. I finished signing the final acquisition papers. I closed the leather folder and handed it to the trembling corporate lawyer across the table. "The meeting is over," I said, my voice calm, articulate, and sovereign. "You can find your own way out." The executives scrambled to pack their briefcases, desperate to escape the heavy, suffocating gravity of the room. When the heavy glass doors clicked shut behind them, the boardroom fell silent. I turned my chair and looked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Standing in the shadows of the corner, perfectly still, was Victor. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit. His massive frame radiated the same chilling restraint and primal power. He had not spoken a word during the entire meeting. He did not need to. His presence alone was enough to bend the city to my will. He stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly toward my chair. He stopped behind me. He reached down, his large, scarred hands gently resting on my shoulders. The scent of dark tobacco and bergamot wrapped around me, grounding me, reminding me of the bloody concrete corridor where our empire was truly born. Victor leaned down, pressing a soft, reverent kiss to the curve of my neck. "Perfect," he whispered, his gravelly baritone vibrating against my skin. I leaned back against his solid chest, looking out over the sprawling grid of Boston. The city belonged to him, but the monster belonged entirely to me. He had burned down my old, invisible world, just to build me a throne, and I was never going to give it back.